ومرحبا بكم في برنامج داخل واشنطن. أنا مضيفكم روبرت ساتلوف. تذهب كل الغنائم إلى المنتصر. هذه عبارة يعود أصلها إلى الفترة انتخاب أندرو جاكسون عام 1828، وهي تعني في هذا السياق أن الفائز في الانتخابات دائما ما يختار الأشخاص الذين يريدهم في المناصب العليا. تحققت هذه العبارة تماما لأن الرئيس الشعبي المحبوب جاكسون هو البطل السياسي الذي يتطلع إليه دونالد ترامب، لدرجة أنه علق لوحة جاكسون بجانب المكتب البيضاوي. بعد اختيارات ترامب تم استقبالها بشكل إيجابي حتى من قبل الديمقراطيين، مثل اختيار السيناتور ماركو روبيو لتولي منصب وزير الخارجية. ولكن بعد الاختيارات الأخرى مثيرة للجدل لدرجة أن بعض الجمهوريين قد لا يدعمونها. سنلقي في حلقة هذا الأسبوع من برنامج داخل واشنطن نظرة متفحصة عن الأشخاص الذين اختارهم دونالد ترامب لأهم المناصب في الحكومة، وذلك مع فريق الخبراء السياسيين هنا تود جيلمان وأنا جيرتيلي وجيم أنتون. Welcome back to Dakhel, Washington. Elections have consequences, and one has to do with the people presidents get to choose for high office. Let's take a look at Donald Trump's top choices for his cabinet and other senior officials. I'm delighted to have with me today Jim Antle and Todd Gilman, and hopefully Anna Giratelli will join us along the way. All right, first, Todd, the second Trump administration seems to be very different than the first Trump administration, with so far only one exception, that's John Radcliffe in intelligence. This is an entirely new team of top officials. What do you make of that?
Well, that's right. Radcliffe, who's a former congressman from Texas, served as the director of national intelligence, which is the position that oversees all 18 spy agencies. This time around, President-elect Trump has nominated him to run the CIA. I think that Trump learned a lot of lessons about the word guardrail in the first term, when a lot of people like his Secretary of State, Secretary of Defense, various White House Chief of Staff, made it their business to rein in his worst instincts and his most excessive attempts to use presidential power. And he is absolutely determined in a second term to surround himself only with political loyalists who will not step in the way and will not throw their bodies down in front of him and prevent him from doing pretty much whatever he wants.
Jim, what do you think when you look first just overall a totally new team from the team he put together in 2016, 2017?
Well, I think if President-elect Trump learned anything from his first term, it's that Washington cliche that personnel is policy is true. I think in business, he was accustomed to the idea that maybe you could hire some people who had different opinions than yours, that they might give you advice, but then ultimately what you as the CEO said would be what goes. Government works a little bit like that, but not quite like that. So if you have people in positions of power who, one, don't really agree with your agenda on policy grounds, and two, have different viewpoints than you do on what is legally and constitutionally appropriate, things are probably not going to work very well for you in terms of implementing the types of things that you want to implement. And so I think the second time around, he is looking for people who he believes will be aligned with what he wants to do.
And so let's take a look at different groups of people. first, Jim, the White House staff, the people closest to the president, who's that going to be? What are they going to look like, and how are they going to differ from the group that was close to the president first time around?
Well, the biggest difference, I think, will be Susie Wiles as White House Chief of Staff. And I think she is the most conventional Republican we've seen in a senior position in this second go-around. And she had a great deal of success co-managing the Trump 2024 campaign. It was, for a Trump campaign, relatively disciplined, not quite the level of leaking that we saw in previous Trump campaigns. And there's some hope that that kind of discipline and lack of leaking and cohesiveness will carry over into the Trump White House. Now, there are a lot of other people on the senior White House staff who are carryovers or sort of OG Trumpers from previous campaigns and the previous term in the White House. You're having Stephen Miller come back as Deputy White House Chief of Staff for Policy. Stephen Chung is going to be the White House Communications Director. He dates back to the earliest days of Trump's national political involvement. Caroline Leavitt is going to be the White House Press Secretary. So some of these are people who've been around for quite a while. But if there's anybody who we're looking at that some people have hopes might live up to the idea of guardrails, that would certainly be Susie Wiles.
Todd, do you think that we have a guardrail chief of staff or a different type of chief of staff?
I'm not sure I see Susie as providing the kinds of guardrails that people like Secretary of State Rex Tillerson or General Mattis or even Reince Priebus, lots of others I can think of from the first term, served as guardrails during the first term. Susie did show an enormous capacity to keep Trump more disciplined than he typically has been. So in that sense, I agree that she'll be able to keep the president focused on things rather than unfocused, as we see when he goes off onto his 90-minute rants during his campaign speeches. But I'm not sure that's the same as being a guardrail in the sense of outright blocking him from doing things like banning Muslims from entering the country or sending special forces into Mexico, whether or not the Mexican government agrees, in order to go after drug cartels, as he has threatened and promised to do. Stephen Miller is an excellent example. Stephen Miller is not somebody who is there to offer guardrails and to serve as an impediment to President Trump. He is there to facilitate President Trump's most aggressive immigrant agenda and to help execute, along with Tom Homan, the new deportation czar, really an unprecedented roundup and deportation of undocumented immigrants in this country. Someone like Caroline Leavitt as the press secretary, just one quick point, she is 27 years old. This is not someone who is going to stand up to President Trump. She's been a very effective pugilistic press secretary spokesperson for the campaign. 8 years ago when he was, or 5 years ago when he was in the White House, she was a low-level press assistant who helped usher the press corps in and out of the Oval Office. This is not people with enormous stature like John Bolton, who had his own reputation and contacts within Washington, who could kind of publicly call out President Trump for stepping over lines.
All right, so let's take a look at one key theme of the Trump campaign, and let's see how it's been translated into appointments. Anna Giratelli, thanks for joining us. The theme of border security, immigration, deportation. Kristi Noem at Homeland Security, Tom Homan at Border Patrol, of course, Stephen Miller in the White House. When you look at all this, Anna, what do you expect?
Yeah, what we see is someone who's planning at the top, someone who's going to carry out the enforcement, and then someone really, Secretary nominee Kristi Noem, who's going to go to Capitol Hill and face off with lawmakers and defend what's going on, really as the face of the department with not a lot of experience dealing with border issues, though she is from a state that is 2 states away from the northern border. Not exactly the same thing. But what we see is President Trump getting all of his ducks in a row to make sure that on day one, these deportations can begin immediately. But I'll just be frank, this is a logistical nightmare to carry this out. You have just 1.3 million people who have a judge has ordered removed from the country, who are in the country. That doesn't include the criminals. And then you have 6,000 ICE officers who are specifically tasked with arresting and deporting people. The numbers don't add up. And even bringing in the military, you have to find people, detain them, then remove them. Will Mexico accept them, or will they be going back to their country of origin? A lot of big questions we're still waiting to see the answers to.
So do you expect there to be first a push to hire a large increase of border patrol before there's a real effort at deportation?
No, and Border Patrol is focused on the actual border. What would handle the deportation would be ICE. But roughly a third of ICE's 20,000 officers are tasked to focus on arresting and deporting people. So not even all of ICE would be focused on that, because there's so much other work that ICE does that is separate from immigration per se. What we probably were going to see are military, not active duty, but National Guard troops. It could be National Guard across the country or from certain states, maybe red states that have helped out Texas in the past at the border, coming together and making their troops available. It could also be local and state law enforcement who are making them available, because what you're going to have to do first is arrest people. And I've been with ICE a number of times. When they go out, they arrest someone. I think of one time in Los Angeles, I embedded with them. We've been out at 4 a.m. and they arrested a guy who had 4 DUI convictions over 16 years. And what they said goes into that was weeks of preparation. So once they decide we're going to arrest this person, they stake out at their house. They follow them to work. They do all that to learn where is the safest place we can intercept this person. Not at a school, not a hospital, not at church, not a library. And they did that when he was walking out of his house to go to his car to go to work one morning very early. And so all of that planning goes into one arrest. You can see how arresting, upwards of 1 million people initially is a huge, thing to attempt.
All right. So let's expand this conversation. Let's take a look at Donald Trump's nominees for his national security team: State, Defense, National Security Advisor, UN Ambassador. Here we have a mix of sort of traditional Republicans like Marco Rubio and sort of newfound MAGA loyalists like Elise Stefanik. Jim, when you look at this team, what do you make of it?
Well, I think even outside of national security, there's an attempt, I think, to recreate the political coalition that elected Trump this time around in his cabinet, and to have disparate elements of this coalition represented in different positions. But in the national security team, that it becomes a little bit difficult, because you have a number of sort of more ordinary Republicans, and I think Marco Rubio fits that bill. Senator Rubio has probably moved more in Trump's direction on a number of issues over the last 8 years or so, but foreign policy overall hasn't really been considered one of them. He's a pretty hawkish guy. I think Elise Stefanik, the nominee for United Nations ambassador, is not substantively very different in terms of her views on these issues, that different from Nikki Haley, for example, but she's much more of a Trump loyalist than Nikki Haley was. So I think you're going to have some tensions between, say, the Tulsi Gabbards and the people who are intended to represent the whole campaign promise of avoiding war and winding down endless wars and less obligations overseas, and some of these people who are certainly loyal to Trump and supportive of Trump, but not necessarily realists or non-interventionists, and maybe still do have some overlap with old school Bush Republicanism.
All right, when we come back after the break, we're going to take a look at some of the more controversial nominees that President-elect Trump has named in just a moment. My guests today include Todd Gilman. Todd recently joined the faculty of Arizona State University's School of Journalism. Previously, he spent over 30 years as a reporter for the Dallas Morning News before retiring as Washington bureau chief. He is past president of the Regional Reporters Association and was elected 3 times to the White House Correspondents Association board. Also with me today is Anna Giratelli. Anna is the Immigration and Homeland Security reporter for the Washington Examiner, where she has reported extensively from America's southern border. Previously, she reported for CQ Roll Call, Yahoo News, and the Oregonian. And I'm glad to have with me today W. James Antle III. Jim Antle is the executive editor of Washington Examiner magazine. Previously, he was politics editor at the Examiner, managing editor of the online Daily Caller, associate editor of the American Spectator, and senior writer for the American Conservative. He's the author of Devouring Freedom: Can Big Government Ever Be Stopped? All right, before we get into some of those provocative nominees, Donald Trump did something very interesting right at the beginning of announcing his team, where he announced who was not going to be on his team. 2 very high-profile names: former Secretary of State Mike Pompeo, former UN ambassador and competitor for the Republican nomination, Nikki Haley. Todd, why did the president first announce who was not going to be in the cabinet?
Well, there are a few reasons. Pompeo was one of the grown-ups in the room, ultimately, who did put a check on Trump on certain foreign policy issues. And Nikki Haley had challenged him in the primary, and that just didn't go over well. We saw toward the end of the campaign where he was struggling to connect with female voters, and he still kept Haley at arm's length, even as she was very publicly, after a while, saying, "Please put me in, coach. I want to help you get elected." So I took that, and I think other people took that as a signal that, once you cross him, you are on a bad list. You are on the naughty list.
You're on the naughty list. All right. Well, speaking of naughty, I don't mean this in a. I'm not trying to be comical about this. Trump's rather unusual nominee for Attorney General, our nation's highest law enforcement official, former Congressman Matt Gaetz. Anna, who is Matt Gaetz, and why is he making an unusual nominee to be the Attorney General of the United States?
I thought you were going to call me naughty, and I was going to say I'm on the nice list this Christmas. So Matt Gaetz, congressman, comes from Florida, calls himself Florida man. But more importantly, he's had some ethics violation and investigations into allegations that he had sex with a minor, an underage girl in 2017. Some other stuff that's gone on with him.
Meaning that just Matt Gaetz is unpopular among even Republicans on Capitol Hill.
Yes. Now, I mean, he's particularly unpopular in the House among House Republicans. And senators tend to have a low view of House members who are outside of leadership getting into these roles, regardless of even all of the specific controversies involving Matt Gaetz. So it might have been difficult, even if you didn't have all of the ethics issues and some of the various controversies that Gaetz has gotten involved in. And so it's going to be a real test, I think, of a number of these nominees are going to be a real test of how much do Senate Republicans want to risk a fight with Trump very early in his term, and how much are they going to be willing to accept unorthodox nominees that they might prefer different people in these jobs?
So speaking of unorthodox nominees, there's one that Donald Trump made to be Secretary of Health and Human Services, Robert F. Kennedy Jr., a storied name in American politics, Todd. But why is he unorthodox for this job?
Well, for many reasons. There are certain views that he holds that are fairly mainstream. He wants to reduce additives in food that people have long been concerned about, and he wants to step up enforcement, that sort of thing. But he is a vaccine skeptic. He does not believe, not just in the COVID vaccine, which obviously was a political flashpoint in the last few years, but in all vaccines that for generations have saved millions of lives, it provably saved millions of lives just in the United States. And he wants to lift any sort of school mandate that students have to have these vaccines before they can come to public schools. He is considered so far outside of the mainstream by the scientific and medical community. He doesn't believe in the scientific method of, well, let's take a look at the evidence. The evidence on vaccines is clear, and he absolutely brushes it aside. I want to get back just real quickly to the Gates thing, just to underscore. Jeff Sessions and Bill Barr as Attorney General under Trump in the first term, absolutely. Sessions was his sin was recusing himself and installing a special counsel to investigate Trump. Bill Barr at the end tried to resist Trump's efforts to stay in power illegally. Trump is absolutely learning the lesson. I can't install anybody who will stand up to me. I want pure loyalists. Nominations like Robert F. Kennedy Jr. or Pete Hegseth for Department of Defense, who are so incredibly underqualified and unorthodox, really fit into a different category of he's just kind of messing with us. He is trying to stir up the American system and show the MAGA base that he is draining the swamp and shaking things up.
What do you think the United States Senate is going to do faced with Matt Gaetz, Robert F. Kennedy Jr., Tulsi Gabbard, Pete Hegseth? If they had to pick one, which one do you think is most vulnerable?
Yeah, they probably can't reject them all. I think Gaetz certainly has the most similarities to John Tower, just the unpopularity and the personal conduct. Obviously, that's what paved the way for Dick Cheney, and that's a big part of history now.
So you think that Matt Gaetz is the most vulnerable. Todd, do you agree?
If I had to guess.
Yeah, no, I would agree that Gaetz is the most vulnerable, but I think there are enormous concerns about Hegseth, who has never led an organization, let alone an organization with 3 million people, with Gabbard, who advocated on behalf of Edward Snowden, who's defected to Russia now. I'm not sure that only one of those gets tossed overboard by the Senate, even though Republicans control the Senate.
All right, we're going to have to hold it there. Lots of interesting questions. We're going to see early in the new year whether or not the new Senate does take up and approve, reject, or even if they go into recess, whether they even have a chance to take a look at these nominees. I want to thank you, Jim Antle, Todd Gilman, and Anna Giratelli for joining us today on Dakhel, Washington. وصلنا إلى نهاية هذه الحلقة من برنامج داخل واشنطن. إذا كانت لديكم أسئلة أو تعليقات حول هذه الحلقة، خاصة حول دور مجلس الشيوخ في تثبيت مسؤولي مجلس الوزراء، أرجو التواصل معي عبر تويتر على هاشتاغ Inside Washington أو مباشرة على @RobSatloff. نلتقي في الأسبوع المقبل وحتى ذلك الحين شكرا لكم وإلى اللقاء.